Moonlit Oath. Isolde March had spent years ignoring the sigil on her wrist, pretending it was nothing more than an old family marking. But when the blood moon rose, the mark burned. The town bells tolled. The streets emptied. The sky turned red. And then she saw him, standing at the edge of the woods, watching her with an expression that sent ice through her veins. "You were never meant to be free," he murmured. "You were meant to belong to me." Chapter 1. The Sigil's Whisper. The teacup rattled against its saucer, a delicate tremor mirroring the one in Isolde March's hand. Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge, rattling the old window panes of her Victorian home, a house that had stood sentinel over the sleepy, coastal town of Havenwood for over a century. Isolde, at 62, felt every bit as weathered and worn as the ancient timbers that held her world together. Her reflection in the darkened glass showed a woman etched with the lines of a life lived, perhaps not fully, but certainly deeply. Silver threads were woven liberally through her once fiery auburn hair, now tamed into a loose braid that rested on her shoulder. Her eyes, once of vibrant green, held a muted, almost haunted quality, reflecting the quiet solitude she'd embraced for the last decade. Isolde reached for the nearly forgotten pot of chamomile tea, her movements slow, deliberate. The scent, usually comforting, did little to soothe the unsettling restlessness that had plagued her all day. It was a primal unease, a feeling of being watched, of something impending. She glanced at the small, circular sigil on the inside of her left wrist. It was a mark she'd borne since birth, a series of intricate, interwoven lines forming a stylized wolf's head within a crescent moon. Her grandmother, a woman steeped in old-world folklore and whispered secrets, had called it the moon's kiss, a mark of something. Isolde had always dismissed it as a fanciful birthmark, an oddity to be ignored. But today, the mark felt different. It itched, a faint, persistent prickling beneath her skin. She rubbed it absently, the familiar texture strangely unfamiliar, as if the skin itself were vibrating. "Nonsense," she muttered, her voice a low rasp in the quiet room. She'd always prided herself on her practicality, her grounded nature. Years of teaching history at the local community college had instilled in her a deep appreciation for facts, for tangible evidence. Superstition was for the gullible, for those who couldn't face the stark realities of life. And Isolde had faced more than her share. The loss of her husband, Thomas, 10 years prior, had left a gaping hole in her life, a void that no amount of tea or historical research could fill. The wind intensified, a sudden, violent gust that shook the house to its foundations. A shiver traced its way down Isolde's spine, not entirely from the cold. The old grandfather clock in the hall chimed 7, its deep, resonant tones oddly ominous in the growing darkness. She rose, stiff joints protesting, and moved to the window, drawing the heavy velvet curtains closed. The town outside was shrouded in an unnatural twilight, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. It was then that she noticed the sky. It wasn't the usual dusky purple of an autumn evening. It was shifting. A subtle, almost imperceptible crimson hue was bleeding into the darkening blue, like a stain spreading across a canvas. Isolde felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She'd seen skies like this before, in old paintings, in illustrations accompanying ancient texts about werewolves. She scoffed, shaking her head. Werewolves. The stuff of legends, of childish nightmares. Yet, the unsettling feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. The sigil on her wrist throbbed, a dull, insistent pulse that echoed the growing unease in her heart. A sudden, sharp rap at the front door made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one ever visited her at this hour. The townspeople of Havenwood, while polite, kept a respectful distance. They knew her story, the tragedy that had shaped her life, and they offered a quiet, unspoken sympathy. But they never intruded. Hesitantly, she moved to the door, peering through the peephole. The distorted image showed a young woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and urgency. It was Clara, the librarian, a woman Isolde considered a friend, in her own quiet way. Isolde opened the door, the wind whipping in, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something else, something wild and untamed. "Isolde," Clara said, her voice trembling. You need to come with me."
"Now."
"Clara, what's wrong? What's happened?" Clara glanced nervously at the crimson-tinged sky. "It's the blood moon, Isolde. It's happening." "Happening?" Isolde repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The words, spoken with such frantic urgency, struck a chord deep within her, a chord that resonated with the throbbing sigil on her wrist. Clara grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "There's no time to explain. They're saying the old stories are true. About the wolves. About the chosen ones." Isolde felt a chill run through her, colder than the autumn wind. The chosen ones. A phrase from her grandmother's whispered tales, a phrase she'd long dismissed as folklore. A phrase that, suddenly, felt terrifyingly real. "Please, Isolde," Clara pleaded. "He'll be looking for you. He always looks for you."
"He."
The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. Who was he? And why was he looking for her? Chapter 2. Crimson Dawn, Shadowed Town. The wind tore at Isolde's coat as Clara pulled her through the deserted streets of Havenwood. The quaint, usually charming houses lining the narrow lanes now seemed menacing, their darkened windows like watchful eyes. The crimson light bleeding across the sky cast an eerie, almost apocalyptic glow over everything, turning the familiar into something alien and threatening. The air itself felt thick, charged with an energy that prickled Isolde's skin and made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Where are we going, Clara?" Isolde asked, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, burgeoning curiosity. She stumbled slightly on the uneven cobblestones, her aging knees protesting the unaccustomed pace. "The old church," Clara replied, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's the only place that's safe. Or, as safe as we can be." The old church. St. Michael's, a Gothic structure that dominated the town square, its spire a skeletal finger pointing towards the ominous sky. It had been abandoned for decades, deemed structurally unsound, its stained glass windows shattered, its wooden doors rotting on their hinges. Isolde had always found it a melancholy place, a relic of a bygone era, a silent testament to forgotten faith. As they neared the square, the source of the town's unsettling silence became apparent. Every house was dark, every door bolted, every window shuttered. The streets, usually bustling with evening activity, were eerily empty. It was as if the entire population had vanished, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic tolling of the town bell, a single, deep, resonant clang that echoed through the empty streets. It was a sound Isolde had heard countless times before, a familiar call to evening prayer, a comforting reminder of community. But tonight, it sounded like a death knell. "Why is everyone hiding?" Isolde asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question felt foolish, even as she asked it. The answer was in the crimson sky, in the chilling tales Clara had hinted at, in the throbbing sigil on her wrist. Clara didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the looming silhouette of the church. They reached the wrought iron gates, rusted and overgrown with ivy, and Clara pushed them open with a groan of protesting metal. The churchyard was a tangle of overgrown weeds and crumbling tombstones, their inscriptions weathered and illegible. The air here was even colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As they approached the church's massive wooden doors, Clara stopped, turning to Isolde with a look of desperate urgency. "Listen to me, Isolde," she said, her voice low and trembling. "The stories they say that on the night of the blood moon, the veil between worlds thins. The werewolves they come out, and they hunt." Isolde felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of unreality, washing over her. Werewolves. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as the ravings of a frightened woman, but the fear in Clara's eyes was too real, the evidence of the deserted town too compelling. And what does this have to do with me?" Isolde asked, her voice shaking. Clara hesitated, her gaze flickering to the sigil on Isolde's wrist. The moon's kiss, she whispered. It's a mark of binding. A pact made long ago between your ancestors and him. Him. That word again, hanging in the air like a shroud. A pact? Isolde repeated, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. What kind of pact? A blood pact, Clara said, her voice barely audible above the tolling bell. A promise of servitude, of belonging. She swallowed hard. They say that every generation, on the night of the blood moon, the one bearing the moon's kiss is claimed. Claimed. The word sent a shiver of ice through Isolde's veins. Claimed by whom? By what? Before Clara could answer, a sound shattered the silence. A low, guttural growl, emanating from the shadows at the edge of the churchyard. It was a sound that bypassed reason, that spoke directly to the primal fear buried deep within the human heart. A sound that promised violence, that promised death. Clara gasped, her eyes widening in terror. He's here, she whispered. He's found you. Isolde's gaze followed Clara's, to the edge of the woods that bordered the churchyard. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and imposing, his silhouette outlined against the crimson sky. He moved with a fluid grace, an animalistic power that was both terrifying and strangely captivating. As he drew closer, Isolde could see his eyes. They glowed with an unnatural light, a predatory intensity that seemed to pierce her very soul. And, in that moment, she knew that the stories were true. She knew that her life, her carefully constructed world of solitude and quiet resignation, was about to be shattered. The blood moon hung heavy in the sky, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, its crimson light bathing the scene in an ethereal, otherworldly glow. He stopped just a few feet from her, the growl subsiding to a low rumble in his chest. The air crackled with unspoken tension, with the weight of centuries-old secrets, with the inevitable clash of destiny and free will. He spoke, the sound rough and low and edged with something that was not entirely human. Isolde March. Chapter 3. The Wolf at the Edge of the Woods. His voice, a deep, resonant rumble, seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath Isolde's feet. It was a voice that held both a threat and a strange, unsettling allure, like the call of a wild, untamed creature. She stared at him, her breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of his presence with the decades she'd spent dismissing such things as mere folklore. He was tall, even taller than she'd initially perceived, his broad shoulders and muscular frame radiating an aura of raw power. He was dressed in dark clothing, a heavy, leather-like jacket, and dark trousers that blended seamlessly with the shadows of the night. His face, it was a face that seemed both ancient and ageless, carved from granite and moonlight. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, and a mouth that was set in a firm, almost cruel line. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to strip away her defenses, her carefully constructed walls of skepticism and resignation. Isolde March, he repeated, his voice softer this time, but no less compelling. He took a step closer, and Isolde instinctively recoiled, her hand flying to the throbbing sigil on her wrist. Clara, who had been frozen in terror, finally found her voice. "Stay away from her, Ryland," she cried, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm. "She doesn't belong to you." The man Ryland shifted his gaze to Clara, his golden eyes narrowing. A flicker of something that might have been amusement, or perhaps contempt, crossed his face. "Brave words, little librarian," he said, his voice laced with a subtle mockery. "But you know as well as I do that she does belong to me. The blood pact is binding. It cannot be broken." Isolde felt a surge of anger, a fierce, protective instinct that surprised even herself. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting Ryland's unflinchingly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I don't belong to anyone. I am my own person." A slow smile spread across Ryland's face, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Such defiance, he murmured. It suits you, Isolde. But defiance will not change the truth. The moon's kiss binds you. It always has. He reached out a hand, his long fingers brushing against the sigil on her wrist. Isolde flinched, a jolt of energy, both terrifying and exhilarating, shooting up her arm. The mark burned, a searing heat that made her gasp. You feel it, don't you? Ryland said, his voice low and intimate. The pull. The connection. It's been there all your life, dormant, waiting for this night. Waiting for me. Isolde stared at his hand, at the way his fingers seemed to trace the intricate lines of the sigil, as if he knew its secrets, as if he held the key to unlocking its power. She felt a strange, unsettling mix of fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to fascination. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryland's smile widened. You will, he said. In time, you will understand everything. The history, the power, the necessity. He withdrew his hand, and the burning sensation on her wrist subsided, leaving behind a lingering warmth. He took a step back, his golden eyes still fixed on hers. I've waited a long time for this, Isolde, he said, his voice laced with a hint of something that sounded almost like regret. For you. Waited? Isolde repeated, her mind reeling. What do you mean, waited? Generations, Ryland said, his gaze drifting towards the crimson moon hanging heavy in the sky. 4 generations. My bloodline has waited for the one bearing the moon's kiss. The one who would fulfill the ancient pact. And what is that pact? Isolde asked, her voice trembling. Ryland's eyes snapped back to hers, their intensity unwavering. To ensure the survival of my kind, he said, his voice low and grave. To protect us from those who would hunt us, who would see us extinguished. He paused, his gaze searching her face, as if looking for something, some sign of understanding, of acceptance. And you believe I can do that? Isolde asked, her voice incredulous. Ryland's expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features. I don't believe, he said. I know. The blood moon has spoken. The sigil has awakened. You are the key, Isolde. You are the one. He took a step closer again. The town bell had ceased its clanging, and the sudden silence that settled on the old churchyard seemed deafening. The only sound was the beating of her heart and the harsh whisper of the wind in the skeletal branches. The air between was charged now, different. It smelled of his skin, of the woods, of something ancient and powerful that sent shivers down her spine. Come with me. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Forgotten Pact. His words, come with me, hung in the air, a simple request that carried the weight of centuries, of a destiny Isolde was only beginning to understand. She looked from Ryland, with his intense golden eyes and unsettling aura of power, to Clara, whose face was a mask of fear and desperation. The choice before her felt impossible, a chasm between the life she knew and a terrifying, unknown future. Come with you where? Isolde asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and a strange, undeniable pull towards this enigmatic man, this creature who claimed she was bound to him by an ancient pact. Ryland gestured towards the dark woods that bordered the churchyard, their depths shrouded in shadows and secrets. To my home, he said. To where you belong. Belong. The word echoed in Isolde's mind, a concept that had felt foreign to her for so long. After Thomas's death, she had retreated into herself, building walls of solitude and resignation, convinced that she no longer belonged anywhere to anyone. And now, this man, this werewolf, was telling her that she belonged with him, with his kind. I can't, Isolde stammered, her mind racing. I don't even know you. I don't understand any of this. Ryland's expression remained impassive, his golden eyes fixed on hers. You will, he said. I will explain everything. I will show you the truth. The truth? Isolde scoffed, a flicker of her old, defiant spirit surfacing. You expect me to believe that werewolves are real, that I'm bound to you by some ancient blood pact. It's insane. Is it? Ryland asked, his voice low and challenging. He gestured towards the deserted town, the crimson sky, the throbbing sigil on her wrist. Look around you, Isolde. Does this feel like the world you thought you knew? Isolde hesitated, her gaze sweeping over the eerie scene. The evidence was undeniable. Something extraordinary, something supernatural, was happening. And she, somehow, was at the center of it. Clara, who had been watching the exchange in silent terror, finally spoke, her voice trembling. Isolde, don't go with him, she pleaded. He's dangerous. He'll hurt you. Ryland turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering to Clara. A shadow of something that might have been annoyance, or perhaps pity, crossed his face. She is safer with me than she is here, he said, his voice firm. There are others who would not be so patient. Others? Isolde's heart pounded in her chest. What others? Were there more like him? And what did they want with her? Ryland turned his attention back to Isolde, his expression softening slightly. I know this is a lot to take in, he said. I know you're afraid. But I promise you, I will not harm you. I will protect you. That is my vow. That is part of the pact. He reached out his hand again, his long fingers extended towards her. This time, there was no sudden jolt of energy, no burning sensation. Just a gentle warmth, a subtle invitation. Isolde stared at his hand, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, confusion, curiosity, and something else. A faint, flickering ember of hope. The hope of understanding, of belonging, of finally finding a purpose after years of quiet despair. She looked at Clara, her eyes pleading for guidance, for reassurance. But Clara could only offer a helpless shrug, her face etched with a mixture of terror and resignation. Isolde took a deep breath, the cold night air filling her lungs. She made her decision. It was a decision born not of logic, not of reason, but of a deep, primal instinct, a feeling that she was being drawn towards something inevitable, something fated. She reached out her hand, her fingers trembling, and placed it in Ryland's. His hand closed around hers, his grip firm but gentle. A surge of warmth flowed through her, a connection that felt both ancient and new, terrifying and strangely comforting. The moment her skin touched his, something shifted. It wasn't visible, not to the naked eye, but Isolde felt it. A click, almost, deep inside her, a locking into place. A finality. Good, he said simply, his voice holding a quiet satisfaction. He didn't smile, his face remained solemn, serious, but his eyes, they seemed to glow a little brighter, reflecting the crimson moon above. He tugged, gently, and she took a step toward him, toward the dark woods and all the unknown that lay within. Let us go. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Love. The woods enveloped them almost instantly, the dense canopy of trees blotting out the crimson glow of the moon, plunging them into a world of shadows and whispers. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and something else, something wild and musky, the scent of Ryland, a scent that both unsettled and intrigued her. He didn't release her hand, his grip firm and reassuring as he led her through the tangled undergrowth. He moved with a silent grace, his steps sure and steady, as if he knew every root and branch, every hidden path. Isolde, on the other hand, stumbled frequently, her city shoes ill-suited for the rough terrain. Where are we going? She asked, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness of the woods. She tried to keep her tone steady, to mask the fear that still gnawed at her, but she couldn't quite conceal the tremor in her voice. To my home, Ryland replied, his voice low and calm. It's not far. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. Isolde's mind raced, trying to make sense of the events of the past hour, of the sudden upheaval of her life, of the impossible reality she was now facing. She glanced at Ryland, at his strong profile, at the way the moonlight filtered through the trees, illuminating his features. He was a mystery, an enigma, a creature of myth and legend made flesh. And yet, there was something about him, something that drew her in, that made her want to understand him, to unravel the secrets that shrouded him. "Tell me about the pact," Isolde said, her voice breaking the silence. "Tell me about this blood bond." Ryland hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "It's a long story," he said. "A story that spans centuries." "I have time," Isolde said, a hint of defiance in her voice. She might be afraid, she might be uncertain, but she wouldn't be a passive participant in her own fate. She would understand the forces that had brought her to this place, the forces that now bound her to this man. Ryland nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. "It began with your ancestor, Elara March," he said. "She was a woman of great power, a healer, a witch, some might say." "A witch." Isolde's breath caught in her throat. Her grandmother had always hinted at such things, at a lineage of women who possessed abilities. But Isolde had always dismissed it as fanciful folklore. "And what did she have to do with your kind?" Isolde asked. "She saved us," Ryland said, his voice laced with a hint of gratitude. "Centuries ago, my kind were hunted, persecuted, driven to the brink of extinction. Elara offered us sanctuary, protection. She used her magic, her knowledge of herbs and rituals, to shield us from those who would harm us." "And the pact?" Isolde prompted. "In return for her protection," Ryland said, "we swore an oath. An oath of loyalty, of service. An oath to protect her and her descendants, to ensure their safety, their well-being." "And that oath it's passed down through the generations?" Isolde asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ryland nodded. "Through the bloodline," he said. "Through the one bearing the moon's kiss. The sigil is a mark of that oath, a reminder of the bond between our two kinds." "But why me?" Isolde asked, her voice filled with confusion. "Why now?" "Because the blood moon has awakened the power," Ryland said. "Because the time has come for the pact to be renewed. Because you are the one. The one." The words echoed in Isolde's mind, a heavy burden settling upon her shoulders. She was the one chosen, the one destined to fulfill an ancient pact, to protect a race of werewolves. It was a responsibility she hadn't asked for, a responsibility she felt wholly unprepared for. "But I'm just an ordinary woman," Isolde said, her voice laced with doubt. "I'm not a healer, I'm not a witch. I don't have any power." Ryland stopped, turning to face her. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones. His golden eyes searched hers, their intensity both unnerving and strangely comforting. "You are more than you know, Isolde," he said, his voice low and sincere. "The power is within you. It always has been. It just needs awakening." He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. The scent of him, wild and earthy, filled her senses, overwhelming her. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the growing tension, the undeniable attraction that was building between them. A forbidden attraction. An impossible attraction. For a moment, just a heartbeat in time, she thought he was going to kiss her. The world narrowed to just the two of them, surrounded by the silent, watchful trees. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled back, his expression hardening. "We must keep moving," he said, his voice tight. "We're almost there." He started forward and she followed, his words, his touch, the almost kiss, hanging in the air around her, confusing and exciting, all at once. A question burned within her, not of the pact, but of him. Of them. What was the price of her freedom, now? And what would be the cost of this love? Chapter 6. Whispers in the Ancient Library. Ryland's home was not what Isolde had expected. She had envisioned a dark, imposing castle, or perhaps a hidden cave, something befitting a creature of myth and legend. Instead, she found herself standing before a large, rambling house, built of weathered stone and ancient timbers, nestled deep within a clearing in the woods. It was a house that seemed to have grown organically from the earth, its lines blurred by centuries of wind and weather, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. "This is it?" Isolde asked, her voice filled with surprise. Ryland nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It's not a palace," he said, "but it's home." He led her to the front door, a massive oak affair, studded with iron, and pushed it open, revealing a large, dimly lit hall. The air inside was warm and inviting, scented with the aroma of wood smoke and something sweet and spicy, like cinnamon and cloves. The hall was filled with antique furniture, worn tapestries, and shelves overflowing with books. It was a room that spoke of history, of tradition, of a life lived far removed from the modern world. Isolde felt a sense of awe, a sense of stepping back in time, into a world she had only read about in books. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," Ryland said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "It's been in my family for generations." He led her through the hall, past a grand staircase that spiraled upwards into the darkness and into a smaller, cozier room. This was a library, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, ancient scrolls, and manuscripts. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room, illuminating the worn Persian rugs and comfortable armchairs. "This is incredible," Isolde said, her voice filled with wonder. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her eyes scanning the titles, recognizing some of the ancient languages she had studied in her academic career. Ryland watched her, his expression unreadable. "You appreciate books?" he asked. "I love them," Isolde said, turning to face him. "They're a window into the past, a connection to those who came before us." "Indeed," Ryland said, his gaze meeting hers. "And this library, it holds many secrets. Secrets about your family, about mine, about the pact that binds us." He gestured towards a large, ornate table in the center of the room, where several ancient-looking books lay open. "I've been researching," he said, "trying to understand more about the moon's kiss, about its power, about your role in all of this." Isolde approached the table, her eyes drawn to the intricate illustrations and faded script in the open books. She recognized some of the symbols, some of the phrases, from her grandmother's whispered tales, from the old texts she had studied. "What have you found?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ryland pointed to a passage in one of the books, a passage written in a language Isolde recognized as Old Norse. "It speaks of a prophecy," he said. "A prophecy about a woman bearing the moon's kiss, a woman who would possess the power to control the wolves." Control the wolves. The words sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. It sounded dangerous. And yet, there was a flicker of excitement, of possibility. "Control them?" Isolde asked, her voice incredulous. "How?" Ryland shook his head. "It's not clear," he said. "The text is fragmented, incomplete. But it suggests a connection. A deep, spiritual bond between the Marked One and the wolves. A bond that can be used for good or for ill." Isolde stared at the passage, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. She, Isolde March, a retired history professor, a woman who had spent her life in quiet solitude, was now being told that she possessed the power to control werewolves. It was absurd. "And yet there's more," Ryland said, his voice drawing her attention to another book, this one open to a page with a detailed illustration of the moon's kiss sigil. The sigil itself, it's not just a mark. It's a conduit, a channel for power. "Power?" Isolde repeated, her voice filled with doubt. "What kind of power?" "The power of the moon," Ryland said, his gaze meeting hers. "The power of the earth. The power of your ancestors." He reached out and gently touched the sigil on her wrist, his fingers tracing the intricate lines. Isolde felt a familiar warmth, a tingling sensation that spread through her arm. "It's dormant now," Ryland said, "but it can be awakened. And when it is, you will have access to abilities you never dreamed of." Abilities. The word hung in the air, heavy with possibilities, with responsibilities, with danger. Isolde felt a surge of fear of the unknown, of the power that might lie dormant within her. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said, her voice trembling. Ryland's expression softened. He took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "You don't have to be ready," he said. "I will be here. I will guide you. I will help you understand. He paused. The fire crackled, filling the silence. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, slow, deliberate. The warmth of his skin against hers was almost overwhelming, a current that sparked and fizzed. But there is something else you must know. He hesitated again, and she could sense the shift in him. A reluctance. A warning. The prophecy, it also speaks of a choice. A choice that you must make. His grip tightened, almost painfully. A choice that will determine not only your fate, but the fate of us all. Chapter 7. Running from Destiny, Embracing Fate. The weight of Ryland's words settled upon his soul like a physical burden. A choice. A choice that would affect not only her own destiny, but the fate of his entire kind. The pressure was immense, suffocating. She pulled her hand away from his, a sudden need for space, for air, overwhelming her. What choice? She asked, her voice tight, almost breathless. She paced the length of the library, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Ryland watched her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like apprehension. The prophecy speaks of 2 paths, he said, his voice low and grave. One path leads to balance, to a harmonious coexistence between our 2 kinds. A renewal of the ancient pact, strengthened by understanding and trust. He paused, his gaze shifting to the fire, as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. The other path leads to destruction, to war, to the extinction of either your kind or mine, or perhaps both. Isolde stopped pacing, her body frozen. Destruction. Va. Extinction. The words were terrifying, incomprehensible. She, a woman who had sought solace in the quiet predictability of history, was now being confronted with the possibility of a catastrophic future, a future she held the power to shape. And what determines which path is taken? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ryland's eyes met hers, their intensity unwavering. You, he said, your choice. Your feelings. Her feelings. Isolde felt a wave of confusion, of frustration. What did her feelings have to do with any of this? She was being asked to make a decision that could affect the fate of 2 entire species, and the deciding factor was her emotions? I don't understand, she said, her voice laced with exasperation. What does that even mean? Ryland sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. The prophecy is vague, he admitted, but it suggests that the power of the moon's kiss, the power to control the wolves, is tied to your emotional state, to your connection with me, his connection with her. Isolde felt a shiver run down her spine. The attraction she had felt for him, the strange, undeniable pull, was now intertwined with this ancient prophecy, with this terrifying responsibility. So what if I reject you? She said, her voice trembling. If I refuse to accept this bond, then what? Va? Ryland's expression darkened. It's possible, he said. The prophecy is not clear on that point. But without the balance, without the connection between us, the old hatreds, the old fears could resurface. The hunters, they would see it as an opportunity. They would come for us. The hunters. He had mentioned them before, those who would hunt his kind, who would see them extinguished. Isolde felt a surge of fear, not just for herself, but for Ryland, for his people. And if I accept you? She asked, her voice barely audible. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating, impossible, and yet, a part of her, a deep, primal part, felt drawn to it, to him. Ryland's expression softened. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, overwhelming her senses. If you accept me, he said, his voice low and husky, then we stand a chance. We can work together to understand the power of the moon's kiss, to control it, to use it for good, to protect both our kinds. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was warm, electrifying, sending a shiver through her. I know this is a lot to ask, he said, his voice sincere. I know it's unfair. But I need you, Isolde. My people need you. And perhaps he hesitated, his gaze searching hers. Perhaps you need me too. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of a destiny neither of them had chosen. Isolde stared into his golden eyes, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and feelings. Fear, doubt, confusion, but also a flicker of hope, of excitement, of something that felt dangerously close to love. A forbidden love, an impossible love, but a love that, perhaps, held the key to saving them all. She had a choice, a terrible, wonderful choice. Run and possibly condemn them all. Or stay, embrace this impossible fate, and fight. Her fingers closed, involuntarily it seemed, around the sigil on her wrist. It no longer burned, but it pulsed with a steady, rhythmic beat, mirroring the frantic thrumming of her heart. She looked at him, saw the question in his eyes, and knew, deep within the core of her being, that there was really no choice at all. She began, the word catching in her throat. Chapter 8. The Scent of Pine and Blood. Isolde started, the word a fragile whisper lost in the vastness of the library. She struggled to find the words, to articulate the maelstrom of emotions that churned within her. Fear warred with fascination, doubt with a burgeoning sense of inevitability. Ryland waited, his golden eyes fixed on hers, his expression patient but expectant. He didn't press her, didn't try to sway her with words or promises. He simply waited. Isolde took a deep breath, the scent of old books and wood smoke filling her lungs, grounding her, reminding her of the tangible world, even as she stood on the precipice of something extraordinary. I don't know what to say, she finally managed, her voice trembling. This is all so much. Too much. Ryland nodded, his expression understanding. I know, he said. It's a lot to take in. A lifetime of belief shattered in a single night. He took a step back, giving her space, allowing her to breathe. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said. You don't have to accept anything. Not yet. But even as he said the words, Isolde knew that it wasn't true. The choice had already been made, the moment she had placed her hand in his, the moment she had felt that connection. The sigil on her wrist pulsed, a constant reminder of the bond that now existed between them, a bond she couldn't ignore, couldn't deny. But the prophecy, she said, her voice hesitant. The two paths, the choice, the prophecy is a guide, Isolde, Ryland said. Not a prison. It shows us the possibilities, the potential outcomes. But it doesn't dictate our actions. We still have free will. We can still choose our own path. But how? Isolde asked, her voice filled with frustration. How can I control something I don't even understand? How can I control you? The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The idea of controlling Ryland, of wielding such power over him, was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Ryland's expression softened. He reached out and gently took her hand again, his fingers interlacing with hers. This time, there was no jolt of energy, no burning sensation. Just a gentle warmth, a reassuring connection. You don't have to control me, Isolde, he said, his voice low and sincere. That's not what this is about. It's about partnership, about trust, about working together, to understand the power of the moon's kiss, to use it for good. He paused, his gaze searching hers. It's about connection, he added, his voice barely a whisper. A connection that transcends the prophecy, that transcends the differences between our kinds. Isolde stared into his eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. The connection he spoke of, she felt it too. It was a pull, a magnetic force that drew her to him, that made her want to trust him, to believe in him, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty. She began again, her voice stronger this time. I want to understand. I wanted to learn. A faint smile touched Ryland's lips. Then I will teach you, he said. I will show you everything. I will share with you the secrets of my kind, the history of the pact, the power of the moon's kiss. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. But it won't be easy, Isolde, he warned. There will be challenges, there will be dangers. The hunters, they are always watching. They will not hesitate to exploit any weakness, any division. Isolde nodded, her resolve hardening. She might be afraid, she might be uncertain, but she wouldn't back down. She wouldn't run. She would face this challenge, this destiny, head-on. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm. It wasn't entirely true, but she wanted it to be true. She needed it to be. Ryland's smile widened, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features, making him seem almost human.
"Good," he said.
"Because the first lesson begins now." He released her hand and gestured towards the woods outside, their dark depths beckoning.
"Come," he said.
"There's something I need to show you." He turned to head toward the door and, taking another deep breath, she followed. The scent of pine that was so strongly him intensified as they walked through the manor, but she noticed, then, beneath, another smell. Faint, metallic, wild. The scent of blood. And while fear still coursed through her veins, something else was there too. Anticipation. Chapter 9. A dance of fear and desire. The night air was crisp and cool against Isolde's skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the library. The crimson moon, though partially obscured by the dense canopy of trees, still cast an eerie glow over the woods, illuminating the path ahead with an otherworldly light. The scent of pine was stronger here, mingled with the damp earth and that underlying, unsettling scent of Ryland. And the faint metallic tang of blood was more persistent, originating, she realized with no small amount of dread, from him. He led her deeper into the woods, moving with a silent grace that was both mesmerizing and unnerving. Isolde struggled to keep up, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made her jump, her imagination conjuring images of lurking dangers, of unseen eyes watching them from the shadows. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, trying to keep the tremor of fear from betraying her. Ryland glanced back at her, his golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "To a place where we can connect," he said. "A place where you can begin to understand the nature of your power." His words sent a shiver down her spine. The nature of her power. The idea was still so foreign, so unbelievable. And yet, she couldn't deny the evidence of her own senses, the throbbing sigil on her wrist, the strange, undeniable pull she felt towards Ryland, the undeniable reality of the man walking beside her. They reached a small clearing, bathed in the crimson moonlight. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat rock, its surface smooth and worn, as if it had been used for centuries, for some ancient ritual. Ryland stopped beside the rock, turning to face Isolde. "This is a sacred place," he said, his voice low and reverent. "A place where the veil between worlds is thin. A place where magic is strong." Magic. The word hung in the air, heavy with possibilities, with dangers. Isolde felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to flee, to return to the safety of her quiet, predictable life. But she stood her ground, her curiosity, her need to understand, overriding her fear. Ryland gestured towards the rock. "Sit," he said. Isolde hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered herself onto the cold, hard surface of the rock. The stone seemed to radiate a strange energy, a tingling sensation that spread through her body. Ryland stood before her, his gaze intense, his presence overwhelming. "Close your eyes," he said. Isolde obeyed, closing her eyes, shutting out the crimson-tinged world, focusing on the darkness behind her eyelids. "Now," Ryland said, his voice a low murmur, "focus on the sigil, on the moon's kiss. Feel its energy, its pulse." Isolde concentrated on her wrist, on the familiar mark that had suddenly become so much more. She felt the throbbing, the faint heat, the connection. It was as if the sigil were a living thing, a part of her, yet also separate. "Good," Ryland said. "Now imagine that energy flowing, spreading through your body, connecting you to me." Isolde hesitated. Connect to him? To this werewolf? The thought was terrifying, exhilarating, impossible, and yet she focused on Ryland, on the scent of him, on the sound of his voice, on the strange, undeniable pull she felt towards him. She imagined a thread of energy, a silver cord, extending from the sigil on her wrist, reaching out to him, intertwining with his own essence. Suddenly, a jolt of energy surged through her, a powerful, overwhelming force that made her gasp. Her eyes flew open, staring at Ryland in shock and wonder. He was glowing. A faint, golden aura surrounded him, outlining his body, highlighting his features, making him seem even more otherworldly. And she felt it too. A warmth, a power, coursing through her veins, making her feel alive. "You feel it, don't you?" Ryland asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and something else. Something that looked like desire. Isolde nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She did feel it. The connection. The power. The attraction. It was undeniable, terrifying, and exhilarating, all at once. He took a step closer, his golden eyes burning into hers. The air between them crackled with energy, with unspoken emotions, with the raw, primal force of their connection. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, sending shivers through her. "It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice husky. And it was. Beautiful and dangerous. A dance of fear and desire, of restraint and surrender. A dance that could lead to their salvation or their destruction. He leaned closer. She could smell the blood, now stronger, and realized it was coming from a wound on his arm, hidden beneath his jacket sleeve. A wound he had likely sustained hunting, or being hunted. The reality of his life, of the dangers he faced, crashed down on her, a sobering counterpoint to the intoxicating magic that swirled between them. He was so close she could feel his breath, see the individual flecks of gold in his irises. He lowered his head, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that he was going to kiss her, and that she was going to let him. Chapter 10. The Hunter's Moon, the Hunted Heart. The kiss was inevitable, a culmination of the tension, the fear, the undeniable attraction that had been building between them since the moment they met. It was a kiss that tasted of pine needles and moonlight, of wildness and something ancient and profound. It was a kiss that shattered the last of Isolde's defenses, the final vestiges of her carefully constructed world of solitude and resignation. Ryland's lips were soft, surprisingly so, against hers, his touch gentle, almost tentative. But beneath the gentleness, Isolde sensed a raw power, a barely restrained hunger that both terrified and exhilarated her. She responded instinctively, her own lips parting, her body leaning into his, seeking the warmth, the connection, the oblivion. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Ryland's arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer, his body pressing against hers. Isolde felt a surge of heat, a wave of desire that washed away her fear, her doubts, her inhibitions. She was lost in the moment, lost in the sensation, lost in him. But even as she surrendered to the kiss, a part of her, a small, rational voice, whispered a warning. This was dangerous. This was forbidden. She was a woman of 62, a retired history professor, a widow who had lived a life of quiet solitude. He was a werewolf, a creature of myth and legend, bound to her by an ancient pact, a pact she barely understood. The thought, the reality, intruded, breaking the spell. Isolde pulled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at Ryland, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion, desire, and fear. Ryland's expression mirrored her own, his golden eyes clouded with a mixture of passion and something that looked like regret. He released her, taking a step back, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough, his breathing uneven. "I shouldn't have." Isolde shook her head, her mind reeling. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's not that. It's just." She struggled to find the words, to articulate the complex emotions that churned within her. "It's all so much," she finally managed. "So fast." Ryland nodded, his expression understanding. "I know," he said. "It's a lot to process." A lot to accept. He paused, his gaze searching hers. But you felt it, didn't you? He asked, his voice low and intense. The connection. The power. Isolde nodded, unable to deny the truth. She had felt it. The connection was undeniable, a force that transcended logic, that defied reason. And the power was intoxicating, exhilarating, terrifying. What happens now? She asked, her voice trembling. Ryland's expression hardened. He glanced at the crimson moon, now partially obscured by clouds, its light casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. Now, he said, his voice grave, we prepare.
Prepare.
The word sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. Prepare for what? For war? For destruction? For the hunters? As if reading her thoughts, Ryland said, the blood moon, it strengthens us. But it also alerts them. The hunters. They know about the pact. They know about you. Isolde felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to flee, to hide. But she stood her ground, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't cower. She would face this challenge, this destiny, head on.
Who are they?
She asked, her voice firm. These hunters? Ryland's expression darkened. They are an ancient order, he said, dedicated to the eradication of my kind. They believe we are abominations, monsters. They have hunted us for centuries, driven us to the brink of extinction. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. And they know about the prophecy, he added. They know that the one bearing the moon's kiss holds the key to our survival or our destruction. They will stop at nothing to eliminate you. Eliminate her. The word hung in the air, heavy with threat, with violence. Isolde felt a chill run through her, colder than the night air.
But why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would they want to kill me? Because you are a threat, Ryland said. Because you possess the power to control us. Because you can tip the balance of power one way or the other. He hesitated.
Because you are bound to me.
Bound to him. The words resonated within her, a reminder of the complex, dangerous relationship that now existed between them. A relationship that was both a source of strength and a liability. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby. Both their heads jerked up. Ryland's body tensed. His eyes glowed. Someone's here, he whispered, and in that moment, she could see the wolf. It was in his posture, in the sharpness of his gaze, in the sudden, predatory stillness of him. And, I don't think it's Clara. Chapter 11. Broken chains, shattered illusions. Ryland moved with a speed that defied human capabilities, positioning himself between Isolde and the direction of the sound, his body a shield, his senses on high alert. He scanned the surrounding woods, his golden eyes piercing the darkness, his nostrils flaring, searching for any sign of the intruder. Isolde stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. The hunters. They were here. They had found her. The reality of her situation crashed down on her with renewed force. This wasn't a fairy tale, a romantic fantasy. This was a fight for survival. Stay behind me, Ryland whispered, his voice low and tense. And don't make a sound. He slowly drew a long, curved knife from a sheath hidden beneath his jacket. The blade gleamed in the crimson moonlight, a deadly weapon in the hands of a creature who was both man and wolf. The silence stretched, taut and oppressive, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Isolde strained her ears, trying to hear any sign of movement, any indication of the hunter's presence. She felt a surge of fear, a primal terror that threatened to overwhelm her. But beneath the fear, there was something else. A flicker of defiance, of anger. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't be a victim. She would fight. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing with a silent grace that mirrored Ryland's own. It was a man, tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. He held a crossbow in his hands, its arrow pointed directly at Ryland. Ryland, the man said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. We meet again. Ryland's body tensed further, his grip tightening on his knife. Silas, he said, his voice a low growl. I should have known it was you. Silas. The name sent a shiver down Isolde's spine. It was a name she had heard before in Ryland's stories, in the ancient texts. Silas was the leader of the Hunters, a ruthless, fanatical warrior dedicated to the eradication of Ryland's kind. You know why I'm here, Silas said, his gaze unwavering. The woman. The marked one. She belongs to us.
Us.
Isolde felt a surge of revulsion, of anger. She didn't belong to anyone. She was her own person. Ryland stepped forward, his body shielding Isolde from Silas's view. She belongs to no one, he said, his voice a deadly threat. And you will not touch her. Silas chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. Brave words, Wolf, he said. But you are outnumbered, outmatched. You cannot protect her. He gestured towards the surrounding woods, and Isolde saw them then. More figures, emerging from the shadows, their faces hidden, their weapons drawn. Hunters. At least a dozen of them, surrounding the clearing, cutting off any escape. Ryland didn't flinch, his gaze fixed on Silas. We'll see about that, he said. The tension in the clearing was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. Isolde felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush of fear and excitement. She was caught in the middle of an ancient conflict, a battle between two species, a fight for survival. And she, somehow, was the key. Silas raised his crossbow, aiming directly at Ryland's heart. Last chance, Wolf, he said. Step aside. Let us take the woman. And you might live to see another moon. Ryland didn't move, his body a solid wall between Isolde and the hunter. Never, he said. Silas sighed, a sound of weary resignation.
So be it, he said.
He pulled the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Isolde saw the arrow leave the crossbow, a silver streak hurtling towards Ryland. She screamed, a wordless cry of terror and denial. But Ryland was faster. He moved with an inhuman speed, dodging the arrow, the deadly projectile whizzing past him, embedding itself in a nearby tree. He lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and Silas, his knife flashing in the moonlight. The hunters attacked, a wave of dark figures descending upon Ryland, their weapons clashing against his blade. Isolde watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. Ryland was a whirlwind of motion, a blur of speed and power, fighting with a ferocity she had never seen before. But he was outnumbered, surrounded, his enemies relentless. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't just stand there, watching him die. She had to help. She focused on the sigil on her wrist, on the moon's kiss, on the power that Ryland had told her she possessed. She closed her eyes, imagining that power, that energy, flowing through her, connecting her to Ryland, to the wolves.
She felt it then.
A surge of warmth, a tingling sensation, spreading through her body. She opened her eyes, and the world seemed different.
Sharper.
Clearer. She could see the hunters, their movements, their intentions, with an almost supernatural clarity. And she could feel Ryland, his fear, his determination, his love. A fierce protectiveness surged within. It felt ancient, powerful, right. She raised her hand, pointed it toward the nearest hunter. Stop. Chapter 12. The Language of Scars. The word, stop, ripped from Isolde's throat, amplified not by volume, but by an unseen force, a power that resonated with the very air around them. It wasn't just a command, it was a shockwave, an invisible ripple that emanated from her outstretched hand, striking the nearest hunter with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his crossbow clattering to the ground, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. He clutched at his chest, as if struggling to breathe, his face contorted in a silent scream. The other hunters, momentarily stunned by the unexpected display of power, hesitated, their attack faltering. Ryland, who had been locked in a fierce struggle with two of them, used the opportunity to break free, his movements swift and deadly. He dispatched one hunter with a swift slash of his knife, and disarmed the other with a brutal kick, sending him sprawling to the ground. Silas, his eyes narrowed, stared at Isolde with a mixture of disbelief and fear. What was that?" he stammered, his voice losing its usual cold composure. Isolde didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the fallen hunter, who was still struggling to regain his breath. She felt a strange mixture of shock, exhilaration, and guilt. She had used her power, the power of the moon's kiss, to hurt someone. But it had been necessary. She had saved Ryland. She had protected herself. Ryland, his chest heaving, his body covered in cuts and bruises, moved to stand beside her, his hand reaching for hers. Their fingers intertwined, and Isolde felt a surge of strength, of connection, flowing between them. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe and pride. "You used your power." Isolde nodded, her gaze meeting his. She saw the admiration in his eyes, the respect, the love. And she saw something else. Something that made her heart ache. Scars. His body was covered in them, not just the fresh wounds from the current fight, but older scars, faded but still visible, a testament to a life of violence, of constant struggle, of survival. Each scar told a story of pain, of loss, of resilience. She reached out and gently touched one of the scars on his arm, a long, jagged line that ran from his elbow to his wrist. "This one," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"How?"
Ryland's expression softened. He looked down at the scar, his fingers tracing its outline. "A hunter's trap," he said. "Years ago. I was careless." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. "You saved me tonight, Isolde," he said. "You saved us all." Isolde shook her head.
"You saved me," she said.
"You've been saving me all along." She meant it not just in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more profound way. Ryland had awakened something within her, something that had been dormant for so long. He had shown her that she was more than just a widow, more than just a retired professor, more than just an ordinary woman. He had shown her that she was powerful, that she was capable, that she was worthy. But the fight wasn't over. Silas, recovering from his initial shock, had regained his composure. He gestured to the remaining hunters, his voice cold and commanding. "Kill them both," he ordered. The hunters, spurred into action, advanced again, their weapons raised, their faces grim. Ryland prepared to fight, his body tensing, his knife held ready. But Isolde stepped forward, her hand raised, her eyes blazing with a newfound power. "No," she said, her voice firm and clear, resonating with the authority of the moon's kiss. "This ends now." She focused her energy, her will, on the hunters, channeling the power of the sigil, the power of her ancestors, the power of her connection with Ryland. She spoke again, not with words, but with feeling. A wave of empathy, of understanding, of compassion washed over the hunters, breaking through their hatred, their fear, their programming. They hesitated, their movements slowing, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion. They looked at each other, their weapons lowering, their resolve crumbling. Silas stared at them, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. "What are you doing?" he screamed.
"Attack. Kill them."
But the hunters didn't obey. They stood there, frozen, caught between their ingrained hatred and the overwhelming force of Isolde's empathy. They were beginning, slowly, painfully, to feel, to understand. Isolde lowered her hand.
Panting.
One by one they dropped their weapons, the clatter echoing in the otherwise silent clearing. The closest hunter looked up at her, and for the first time she saw him. Not a monster. Not an enemy.
A man.
With fear in his eyes.
We
can't," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Silas's eyes were wild. He was shaking. He pointed a trembling finger at Isolde, a low snarl emitting from his throat, but he couldn't speak. He had been stripped, in that moment, of all his power, of everything he thought he was. Chapter 13. Beneath a sky of shifting stars. Silas stood, a solitary figure of impotent rage, amidst the disarmed hunters, his authority shattered, his worldview crumbling around him. The crimson moon, which had seemed to empower him only moments before, now felt like a mocking witness to his defeat. He looked at Isolde, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, to curse her, to threaten her, but no words came out. He was broken. Ryland stepped forward, his knife still in his hand, but his posture was no longer defensive. He looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and contempt. "It's over, Silas," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Your crusade of hatred ends here." Silas finally found his voice, a raspy, broken whisper.
You haven't won," he said.
This is not the end. There are others who will continue the fight." Ryland nodded. "Perhaps," he said, "but you are finished." He turned to the disarmed hunters, his gaze sweeping over them. "You have a choice," he said. "You can continue to follow Silas, to cling to your hatred, to your fear. Or you can choose a different path. A path of understanding, of peace." The hunters looked at each other, their expressions uncertain, their minds struggling to comprehend the events of the past few minutes. They had been trained, indoctrinated, to hate, to fear, to kill. And now they were being offered a choice. One by one, they began to step away from Silas, moving towards Ryland, towards Isolde. They didn't speak, but their actions spoke louder than words. They were choosing a different path. Silas watched them go, his face contorted in a mask of despair and betrayal. He was alone, abandoned, his power gone. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching for a hidden dagger at his belt. But before he could draw it, Ryland moved with an inhuman speed, disarming him with a swift, precise movement. The dagger clattered to the ground, and Silas slumped to his knees, defeated. He looked up at Ryland, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and resignation. "Kill me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Finish it." Ryland looked at him, his expression unreadable. He raised his knife, and for a moment, Isolde thought he was going to do it. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, he lowered his knife, his gaze shifting to Isolde. He saw the question in her eyes, the plea. He shook his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "That's not our way. We are not murderers." He turned back to Silas. "You will be banished," he said. "Exiled. You will never again set foot on this land, never again threaten my kind or hers." Silas didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground, his body trembling. He was a broken man, stripped of his power, his purpose, his identity. Ryland turned to the hunters who had chosen to follow him, to follow Isolde. "We will return to Blackwood Manor," he said. "We will talk. We will heal." He extended his hand to Isolde, and she took it, her fingers interlacing with his. She felt a surge of warmth, of connection, of love. They walked back towards the manor, leaving Silas alone in the clearing, a solitary figure beneath the shifting stars. The crimson moon had faded, replaced by a softer, gentler light, the sky beginning to lighten with the approaching dawn. As they walked, Isolde looked up at the sky, at the stars, at the possibilities. She had made a choice that had changed her life, that had changed the world. She had embraced her destiny, her power, her love. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was just the beginning. She glanced at Ryland, at his strong profile, at the way the moonlight illuminated his features. He was a mystery, an enigma, a creature of both darkness and light. And he was hers. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. Ryland smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features, making him seem almost human. "Now," he said, "we build a new future. Together." He squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. And as they walked, hand in hand, towards the dawn, Isolde felt a sense of hope, of purpose, of belonging that she had never felt before. The scars, both his and hers, were still there, a reminder of the past. But they were also a testament to their resilience, their strength, their love. A love that had been forged in the crucible of conflict, a love that had the power to change the world, a love that would endure. She leaned her head against his shoulder as they walked, drawing strength from his presence, from his warmth, from the steady beat of his heart that echoed, now, so perfectly in time with her own. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in a very long time, Isolde felt free. Chapter 14. The Curse of the Blood Moon Binding. The days following the confrontation with Silas and the hunters settled into a strange, almost surreal rhythm. Blackwood Manor, once a place of quiet solitude for Ryland, became a sanctuary, a refuge for the former hunters who had chosen to abandon their old ways. They were a diverse group, men and women of varying ages and backgrounds, united by their shared past and their uncertain future. Isolde, initially apprehensive, found herself drawn to them, fascinated by their stories, their struggles, their humanity. She spent hours talking to them, listening to their accounts of their lives, their training, their indoctrination. She learned about their fears, their doubts, their regrets. And she learned about the curse. It wasn't a curse in the traditional sense, a spell cast by a witch or a demon. It was a curse of belief, of ingrained hatred, passed down through generations, reinforced by ritual and tradition. The hunters believed that werewolves were monsters, abominations that needed to be eradicated. They believed that they were doing the world a service, protecting humanity from a terrifying threat. But Isolde, through her connection with Ryland, through the power of the moon's kiss, had shown them another way. She had shown them that werewolves were not monsters, but beings capable of love, of compassion, of humanity. Ryland, meanwhile, was grappling with his own challenges. He was the leader, the alpha of his pack, and he had a responsibility to protect them, to guide them, to lead them into this new, uncertain future. He spent hours in the library, poring over ancient texts, searching for answers, for guidance, for a way to break the cycle of violence and hatred. He also spent hours with Isolde, teaching her about her power, about the moon's kiss, about their connection. They would practice in the clearing, under the moonlight, Ryland guiding her, showing her how to channel her energy, how to control her abilities. The attraction between them was undeniable, a constant hum beneath the surface of their interactions. They would steal glances, their hands would brush, their bodies would gravitate towards each other. But there was a hesitancy, a restraint, holding them back. The blood moon binding. It was more than just a mark, more than just a connection. It was a force that drew them together, that amplified their emotions, that controlled their destinies. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, Isolde finally voiced the question that had been haunting her. "The binding," she said, her voice low and hesitant. What does it mean? For us?" Ryland looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret.
"It means we are connected," he said.
"On a level that goes beyond physical attraction, beyond love. But is it real?" Isolde asked. "Our feelings, are they ours? Or are they the binding?" Ryland sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "That's the question, isn't it?"
he said.
"The question that has plagued my kind for centuries." He paused, his gaze shifting to the fire, as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "The binding, it amplifies our emotions," he said. "It intensifies our connection. But it doesn't create them. It doesn't force us to feel something that isn't already there. So what we feel," Isolde said, her voice trembling. "It's real?" Ryland's eyes met hers, their intensity unwavering. "Yes," he said. "It's real. But it's also complicated. The binding, it can be a gift. But it can also be a curse." A curse. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications.
"How?"
Isolde asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It can consume us," Ryland said. "It can overwhelm us. It can drive us mad." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "There are stories," he said. "Stories of couples, bound by the blood moon, who lost themselves, who destroyed each other." Isolde felt a chill run down her spine. Destroyed each other. The thought was terrifying. "But that won't happen to us," she said, her voice more a plea than a statement. Ryland reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His touch was warm, reassuring.
It won't, he said, his voice firm.
Because we're different. Because we're stronger. Because we have choice. He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. We can control the binding, Isolde, he said. We can use its power for good. We can choose love. Over fear. Over destiny. His words, his touch, his belief in her, in them, washed over her, a wave of warmth and reassurance. But still, a small seed of doubt remained, planted deep within her heart. Could they really control the binding? Or were they destined to be consumed by it, like so many others before them? The fire crackled, a sudden flare of light illuminating the room. Ryland's eyes were on hers, and the intensity there was almost frightening. It was raw, vulnerable, and utterly captivating. He leaned in, slowly, and the space between them seemed to shrink, to vanish. He was going to kiss her, and she knew, despite her fear, despite the uncertainty, that she wouldn't stop him. Chapter 15. Where shadows lie, truth awakens. The kiss was different this time. It wasn't the desperate, almost frantic joining of two souls caught in a storm. It was slow, deliberate, a gentle exploration, a tender communion. It was a kiss that spoke of trust, of understanding, of a deepening connection that transcended the blood-moon binding, that defied the curse, that whispered of hope. Ryland's lips were soft against hers, his touch feather-light, his breath warm against her skin. Isolde responded instinctively, her own lips parting, her body melting into his, seeking the solace, the comfort, the love that he offered. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense, but there was a control, a restraint, that hadn't been there before. They were aware of the power that flowed between them, the power of the binding, but they weren't consumed by it. They were mastering it. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their hearts beating in unison. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room, illuminating their faces, their smiles, their love.
See?
Ryland whispered, his voice husky. We can control it. Isolde nodded, her heart filled with a sense of relief, of joy, of wonder. She had been so afraid, so uncertain, but now she believed. She believed in him, in them, in their ability to overcome the curse, to forge their own destiny. But their newfound peace was short-lived. A sudden crash from downstairs, followed by a chorus of shouts and growls, shattered the tranquility of the library. Ryland's body tensed, his eyes flashing with alarm. What is it? Isolde asked, her voice filled with fear. I don't know, Ryland said, his hand reaching for the knife he always carried. But it sounds like trouble. He moved to the door, his senses on high alert, his body poised for action. Isolde followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. They reached the top of the grand staircase, looking down into the main hall. What they saw made their blood run cold. The hall was in chaos. The former hunters, who had been settling into their new lives at Blackwood Manor, were under attack. But not by outsiders. By each other. They were fighting amongst themselves, their faces contorted in rage, their eyes filled with a darkness that Isolde had seen before, in Silas, in the hunters who had attacked them in the clearing. What's happening? Isolde cried, her voice filled with horror. Ryland's expression was grim. The curse, he said. It's fighting back. He explained, as they cautiously descended the stairs, that the blood-moon binding was not just a connection between two individuals. It was a connection to the source of the werewolves' power, a source that was both ancient and volatile. The hunters' ingrained hatred, their belief system, it was all tied to that same source. And Isolde's actions, her breaking of their conditioning, had disrupted the balance, causing a backlash. The former hunters were caught in the middle, their minds and bodies a battleground between their old beliefs and their newfound freedom. Ryland tried to intervene, to stop the fighting, but his words were ignored, his presence barely registered. The former hunters were lost in their own internal struggles, their own demons. Isolde watched in despair, her heart aching for them, for their pain, for their confusion. She knew she had to do something. She had to help. She focused on the sigil on her wrist, on the moon's kiss, on the power that flowed through her. She closed her eyes, imagining that power, that energy, reaching out to the former hunters, calming them, soothing them, healing them. She spoke, not with words but with feeling. A wave of empathy, of understanding, of love, washed over the hall, filling the space, enveloping the fighting figures. Slowly, gradually, the fighting subsided. The growls faded, the shouts died down, the rage dissipated. The former hunters stood there, dazed, confused, their eyes slowly clearing, their bodies relaxing. They looked at each other, their expressions shifting from anger to shame. They looked at Isolde, their eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Ryland moved to Isolde's side, his hand reaching for hers. Their fingers intertwined, and Isolde felt a surge of strength, of connection, flowing between them. "You did it again," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Isolde nodded, her gaze meeting his. She saw the love in his eyes, the respect, the hope. But she also saw something else. A shadow. A flicker of doubt. He knew, as she did, that this was not the end. The curse was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. The fighting had stopped, but the underlying tension remained, a palpable unease that settled over Blackwood Manor. The truth, however painful, had awakened. The binding was a powerful force, and they were only just beginning to understand its complexities, its dangers, its potential. The silence was broken by the soft whimpering of one of the former hunters, a young woman who had been particularly affected by the outburst. Isolde went to her, kneeling beside her, offering a comforting hand. The woman looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand," she whispered. "What's happening to us?" Isolde took her hand, her touch gentle, reassuring. "It's going to be all right," she said. "We'll figure it out. Together." Chapter 16. A pact sealed in starlight. The aftermath of the internal conflict left Blackwood Manor shrouded in a heavy silence, punctuated by the occasional sob or whispered conversation. The former hunters, shaken and confused, huddled together, seeking comfort and reassurance in each other's presence. Ryland, his face etched with worry, moved among them, offering words of encouragement and support. Isolde, feeling a deep sense of responsibility for their plight, stayed by their side, her presence a calming influence, her touch a source of healing. She had used her power, the power of the moon's kiss, to quell the violence, to soothe their troubled minds. But she knew it was only a temporary solution. The underlying cause of their turmoil, the curse of the blood moon binding, remained. As the night wore on, and the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky with hues of pink and gold, Ryland gathered everyone in the main hall. He stood before them, his posture tall and strong, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of determination and hope. "We have faced a difficult night," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "A night that has tested our strength, our resolve, our unity." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the former hunters, his eyes lingering on Isolde. "But we have also learned something important," he continued. "We have learned that we are not alone, that we have the power to overcome the darkness, to break free from the chains of the past, to forge a new future." He spoke of the curse, of the blood moon binding, of the ancient conflict between hunters and werewolves. He spoke of Isolde, of her power, of her connection to him, of their shared destiny. And he spoke of a new pact. Not a pact of blood and servitude, but a pact of trust and understanding, a pact of love. "I propose," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "that we create a new covenant. A covenant between our two kinds, a covenant based not on fear and hatred, but on respect and cooperation." He turned to Isolde, his eyes locking with hers. "Isolde," he said, "will you stand with me? Will you help me to build this new future, to heal the wounds of the past, to create a world where werewolves and humans can coexist in peace?" Isolde's heart swelled with emotion. She looked at Ryland, at his strong, noble face, at the love and hope that shone in his eyes. She looked at the former hunters, at their eager, expectant faces, at their newfound trust. And she knew what she had to do. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with the power of the moon's kiss. "I will." A collective sigh of relief swept through the hall, followed by a murmur of excitement and hope. The former hunters, who had once been their enemies, now looked at them with admiration, with gratitude. Ryland smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features, making him seem radiant. "Then let us begin," he said. He proposed that they create a council, a body composed of both werewolves and former hunters, to discuss their differences, to address their concerns, to build a bridge between their two worlds. He proposed that they share their knowledge, their skills, their lives. He proposed that they learn to trust each other. The former hunters readily agreed, eager to participate in this new venture, this new hope. They chose their representatives, men and women who had demonstrated wisdom, compassion, and a willingness to change. And then, Ryland turned to Isolde, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the blood moon binding, a love that was real. "Isolde," he said, his voice low and intimate, "there is one more thing we must do." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, silver ring. It was an ancient ring, its surface etched with intricate symbols, the same symbols that adorn the moon's kiss sigil. "This ring," he said, "has been passed down through my family for generations. It is a symbol of the blood moon binding, a symbol of our connection." He took her hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "But it is also," he continued, "a symbol of our choice. Our choice to defy the curse, to forge our own destiny, to love each other." He looked into her eyes, his gaze intense, his love overwhelming. "Isolde March," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "will you be my partner? Will you be my mate? Will you be my wife?" Tears welled up in Isolde's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of love. She had never thought she would find love again after Thomas. She had never thought she would find a purpose, a belonging, after her quiet, solitary life. But here she was, standing before this extraordinary man, this werewolf, who had shown her a world beyond her wildest dreams, who had awakened a power within her she never knew she possessed, who had loved her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Ryland. Yes." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that sealed their pact, their love, their future. A kiss that was witnessed not by the crimson moon, but by the soft, gentle light of the rising sun, by the hopeful faces of the former hunters, by the shifting stars. A kiss under a clear, bright sky, signifying a new beginning, free from the shadows of the past. It was a promise whispered to the dawn they would face whatever came next together. Chapter 17. The Gathering Storm, the Unfolding War. News of the alliance between Ryland's pack and the former hunters spread quickly, carried on the wind, whispered in the shadows, a beacon of hope in a world steeped in darkness and fear. But not everyone welcomed this new development. In the hidden enclaves of the remaining hunter factions, the news was met with outrage, with disbelief, with fury. They saw it as a betrayal, a perversion of the natural order, a threat to their very existence. They vowed to destroy this alliance, to crush this rebellion, to eradicate the werewolves and their human sympathizers. And so, the gathering storm began. Rumors of hunter activity increased, whispers of planned attacks, of targeted assassinations, of all-out war. Ryland, ever vigilant, strengthened the defenses of Blackwood Manor, training his pack and the former hunters in combat, preparing them for the inevitable confrontation. Isolde, too, was preparing. She was learning to control her power, to harness the energy of the moon's kiss, to protect those she loved. She spent hours practicing with Ryland, honing her skills, pushing her limits, discovering the full extent of her abilities. She also spent hours with the council, mediating disputes, offering guidance, fostering understanding between the werewolves and the former hunters. She was the bridge between their two worlds, the symbol of their unity, the hope for their future. The bond between Isolde and Ryland deepened, strengthened by their shared purpose, their shared danger, their shared love. They were inseparable, their lives intertwined, their destinies linked. But the threat of war loomed large, casting a shadow over their newfound happiness, their fragile peace. They knew that the hunters would not rest until they had destroyed them, until they had extinguished the flame of hope that they had ignited. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of Blackwood Manor, watching the sunset paint the sky with vibrant colors, Ryland turned to Isolde, his expression grave. "They're coming," he said, his voice low and tense. "I can feel it." Isolde nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. She, too, could feel it. The tension in the air, the growing sense of unease, the whispers on the wind. "How many?"
she asked.
Ryland shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "But it's a lot. More than we've ever faced before." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "We may not win this, Isolde," he said. "We may lose everything." Isolde reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Her touch was warm, reassuring. "Then we will face it together," she said, her voice firm and clear. "We will fight. We will survive." Ryland squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "Together," he repeated. The following days were filled with frantic preparations. The defenses of Blackwood Manor were reinforced, weapons were sharpened, strategies were discussed, and prayers were whispered. The werewolves and the former hunters, once enemies, now stood side by side, united in their determination to protect their home, their families, their future. They had found a common cause, a common purpose, a common love. And then, on a dark, moonless night, the storm broke. The hunters attacked, a massive force descending upon Blackwood Manor, their numbers overwhelming, their intentions deadly. They came from the woods, from the shadows, their weapons gleaming in the darkness, their faces contorted in rage and hatred. The battle was fierce, brutal, relentless. The air was filled with the sounds of clashing steel, the roars of werewolves, the screams of the wounded, the cries of the dying. Ryland fought like a man possessed, his movements swift and deadly, his body a blur of motion. He was everywhere, protecting his pack, defending his home, fighting for his love. Isolde, too, was fighting. She stood on the ramparts of Blackwood Manor, her hands raised, channeling the power of the moon's kiss, deflecting arrows, shielding her allies, striking down her enemies. She was a force of nature, a beacon of light in the darkness, a warrior. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain, the casualties mounting. The werewolves and the former hunters fought bravely, fiercely, but they were outnumbered, outmatched. They were slowly being pushed back, their defenses crumbling, their hope fading. And then, just as it seemed that all was lost, a new sound pierced the night. A howl. A howl that was both familiar and different. It was the howl of other werewolves. Werewolves who had heard the call, who had seen the beacon of hope, who had chosen to join the fight. From the woods, from the shadows, they emerged, a pack of reinforcements, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their fangs bared, their intentions clear. They were led by a female werewolf, tall and strong, her fur the color of silver, her eyes the color of ice. She was Ryland's sister, Lyra, a warrior who had been exiled from the pack years ago, a warrior who had now returned to fight for her brother, for her people, for their future. The arrival of the reinforcements turned the tide of the battle. The hunters, surprised and overwhelmed, began to falter, their attack losing its momentum, their confidence shattered. The werewolves and the former hunters, emboldened by the arrival of their allies, fought with renewed vigor, their spirits lifted, their hope rekindled. The battle continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The hunters were defeated, routed, their forces scattered, their leadership decimated. As dawn broke, painting the sky with the first light of a new day, the fighting ceased. The silence that descended upon Blackwood Manor was broken only by the sobs of the wounded, the whispers of the survivors, the cries of victory. The storm had passed. The war had begun, but they had survived. They had won. Together. The cost, however, was etched on every face, in every trembling hand. The cost was steep. Chapter 18. Blood and Ashes, Love and Loss. The victory was bittersweet. The grounds of Blackwood Manor were littered with the bodies of the fallen, both hunters and defenders, a grim testament to the ferocity of the battle. The air was thick with the scent of blood and ashes, the silence broken only by the mournful cries of the bereaved. Isolde, her body aching, her spirit weary, moved among the survivors, offering comfort, tending to wounds, her presence a beacon of hope in the aftermath of the devastation. She had used her power extensively during the battle, channeling the energy of the moon's kiss to protect her allies, to strike down her enemies. But the exertion had taken its toll, leaving her feeling drained, depleted, her own reserves dangerously low. Ryland, his body covered in cuts and bruises, his fur matted with blood, searched for Isolde among the wreckage, his heart pounding with fear. He had seen her fighting, seen her power, seen her vulnerability. He had to find her, to make sure she was safe, to hold her in his arms. He found her near the shattered gates of the manor, kneeling beside the body of a young former hunter, a woman who had befriended Isolde, a woman who had died protecting her. Tears streamed down Isolde's face, her body shaking with grief. Ryland knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her close. He didn't speak, he simply held her, offering his strength, his comfort, his love. She saved me, Isolde whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She took an arrow meant for me. Ryland held her tighter, his heart aching for her pain, for her loss. He knew that Isolde felt responsible for everyone, that she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, that she blamed herself for the deaths of those who had fallen. "It's not your fault, Isolde," he said, his voice low and gentle. "You did everything you could. You saved so many lives." Isolde shook her head, her tears falling onto his fur.
"But it's not enough," she said.
"It's never enough." Ryland knew that she was right. The war was far from over. The hunters would regroup, they would retaliate, they would continue to fight. And there would be more battles, more losses, more pain. But he also knew that they couldn't give up. They couldn't lose hope. They had to keep fighting, for their future, for their love, for the world they were trying to build. He lifted her chin, forcing her to look at him. His golden eyes were filled with love, with determination, with unwavering belief in her. "We will get through this, Isolde," he said, his voice firm and clear. "Together. We will honor the fallen, we will heal the wounded, and we will continue to fight. For a better future." Isolde nodded, her gaze meeting his. She saw the strength in his eyes, the love, the hope. And she drew strength from him, from their connection, from their shared destiny. They spent the following days tending to the wounded, burying the dead, and rebuilding the defenses of Blackwood Manor. The werewolves and the former hunters worked side by side, their shared grief, their shared loss, forging an even stronger bond between them. Lyra, Ryland's sister, proved to be a valuable ally, her strength, her experience, her fierce loyalty, bolstering their spirits, strengthening their resolve. She and Isolde formed a close bond, a sisterhood forged in the crucible of battle, a shared understanding of the burdens and the responsibilities of leadership. But the war was not over. A week after the battle, a scout returned to Blackwood Manor, bearing grim news. The remaining hunter factions had united, forming a coalition, a massive army, determined to crush them once and for all. They were coming. Ryland gathered the council, the werewolves and the former hunters, to discuss their options. They were outnumbered, outmatched, their resources depleted. "We cannot win a direct confrontation," Lyra said, her voice grim. "We will be slaughtered." "We could flee," one of the former hunters suggested.
"Scatter. Hide."
But Ryland shook his head.
"No," he said.
"We will not run. We will not hide. We will stand and fight. We will defend our home." He turned to Isolde, his eyes filled with a question, a plea. He knew that she held the key, that she possessed the power to turn the tide. But he also knew that using that power would come at a cost that might be too high. Isolde understood. She knew what he was asking. She knew what she had to do. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with determination.
I have a plan, she said.
Her plan was audacious, dangerous, almost suicidal. But it was their only hope. It was a plan that relied on her power, on the moon's kiss, on her connection to Ryland, on their love. It was a plan born out of desperation, but fueled by the desperate desire for a future that was worth the ultimate sacrifice. It was time to end this, once and for all. Chapter 19. The Heart's True North. Isolde's plan was as breathtaking in its simplicity as it was terrifying in its implications. She would use the power of the moon's kiss, amplified by her connection with Ryland, to create a disruption. Not a physical attack, not a wave of force, but a wave of empathy. A wave of understanding that would reach into the hearts and minds of the approaching hunter army, breaking their conditioning, shattering their hatred, forcing them to feel. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to end the war without further bloodshed, to appeal to the humanity that she believed still existed within even the most hardened hunters. But it was a gamble that came with enormous risks. To achieve the necessary level of power, Isolde would need to draw directly from the source of the blood moon binding, the ancient, volatile energy that fueled the werewolves' transformation and the hunter's fanaticism. It was a source that could overwhelm her, consume her, drive her mad. And it required Ryland. He would be her anchor, her tether to reality, his love the guiding light that would prevent her from being lost in the maelstrom of power. But it also meant exposing him to the same risks, putting his life, his sanity on the line. They prepared in the clearing, the same place where their connection had first blossomed, the same place where they had faced the hunters before. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation, with fear. The former hunters and the werewolves, their faces grim, their hearts heavy, stood in a circle around the clearing, their presence a silent testament to their trust, their faith, their love for Isolde and Ryland. They knew the risks, they understood the stakes, and they were prepared to face whatever came. Lyra, her silver fur gleaming in the moonlight, stood beside Ryland, her hand resting on his shoulder, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and pride. She knew the dangers better than anyone, having witnessed the destructive power of the blood moon binding firsthand. But she also knew that this was their only hope. Isolde stood in the center of the clearing, her eyes closed, her body trembling slightly. She wore a simple white dress, a stark contrast to the dark clothing of the others, a symbol of her purity, her strength, her vulnerability. Ryland moved to stand before her, his golden eyes locking with hers. He reached out and took her hands, his fingers interlacing with hers. Their touch was electric, a surge of energy flowing between them, strengthening their connection, amplifying their love. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. Isolde nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," she said. "I am." She closed her eyes again, focusing on the sigil on her wrist, on the moon's kiss, on the power that flowed through her. She imagined that power, that energy, expanding, growing, reaching out to Ryland, to the werewolves, to the former hunters, to the approaching army.
She felt it then. The pull.
The ancient, volatile energy of the blood moon binding, surging through her, overwhelming her senses, threatening to consume her. Pain shot through her body, a searing heat that made her gasp. Her vision blurred, her mind clouded, her thoughts fragmented. But Ryland was there. His grip on her hands tightened, his presence a beacon in the darkness, his love a lifeline that kept her tethered to reality. He spoke to her, his voice a low murmur, a constant reassurance, guiding her, anchoring her, reminding her of who she was, of what she was fighting for, of their love. "Isolde," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Focus.
Focus on me.
Focus on us." His words, his love, pierced through the chaos, through the pain, through the madness. She clung to him, to his presence, to his strength. Slowly, gradually, she began to regain control. The pain subsided, her vision cleared, her thoughts coalesced. She was still connected to the source, still channeling the immense power of the blood moon binding, but she was no longer overwhelmed by it. She was mastering it. She opened her eyes, and the world seemed different.
Sharper. Clearer.
She could feel the approaching army, their fear, their hatred, their humanity. She raised her hands, and a wave of energy, visible as a shimmering, golden light, emanated from her, spreading outwards, towards the approaching hunters, carrying with it a message of empathy, of understanding, of love. It was a message that transcended words, that bypassed reason, that spoke directly to the heart. A message that shattered the chains of conditioning, that broke the curse of hatred, that awakened the humanity within. It was a message of hope. She felt the impact, the sudden shift in the emotional landscape, the wave of confusion, of doubt, of remorse that washed over the approaching army. And then silence. The sound of marching feet, the clatter of weapons, the whispers of anticipation ceased. The hunters had stopped. Isolde lowered her hands, her body trembling with exhaustion, her spirit drained. She looked at Ryland, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion.
It
worked, she whispered. Ryland wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his body shaking with emotion. You did it, Isolde, he said, his voice choked with emotion. You saved us all. They stood there, embraced, for a long moment, their hearts beating as one, their love a beacon in the darkness, their future uncertain, but filled with hope. The werewolves and former hunters erupted in cheers, cries of joy and relief, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. But the quiet certainty in Isolde's heart was the loudest of all. They had done it. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. The silence that followed Isolde's act of empathetic power was profound, unsettling. It was a silence pregnant with uncertainty, with the fragile hope of peace, and the lingering fear of renewed conflict. Ryland held Isolde close, his strength a tangible comfort against the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. From the edge of the woods, figures began to emerge. Not in a charge, not with weapons drawn, but slowly, hesitantly, their faces etched with confusion, with doubt, with a glimmer of something new. Something that looked like understanding. These were the hunters, the army that had marched on Blackwood Manor with the intention of destroying everything Isolde and Ryland stood for. But now, they stood disarmed, not by force, but by the overwhelming power of empathy, by the shattering of their ingrained hatred. Leading them was a figure Isolde recognized, even from a distance. A man who had been consumed by fanaticism, driven by a relentless need to eradicate werewolves. Silas. He walked differently now. His shoulders were slumped, his gaze downcast, his movements lacking their former confidence and aggression. He stopped a short distance from Isolde and Ryland, his eyes finally lifting to meet Isolde's. There was no hatred in his gaze now.
No fury.
Only a profound sadness. A weariness that spoke of a lifetime of conflict, of a worldview shattered in a single, transformative moment. It cannot be, Silas whispered, his voice hoarse, his words barely audible. All these years, all the bloodshed, Isolde stepped forward, separating herself from Ryland's embrace, though her hand still sought his, their fingers intertwined. She looked at Silas, not with judgment, not with anger, but with compassion. It can be, she said, her voice clear and strong, resonating with the power of the moon's kiss, a power that now flowed with gentle strength, not overwhelming force. It must be. The cycle of hatred, it ends here.
Now.
Silas shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. I don't understand, he said. How could you do this? How could you forgive us? Isolde smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. It's not about forgiveness, Silas, she said. It's about understanding. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, about choosing love over fear, about building a better future. Together. Silas looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning, struggling to comprehend the profound shift that had occurred within him, within his army, within the world. He looked at Ryland, at the werewolves and former hunters who stood behind them, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and apprehension. He saw no hatred there, no thirst for revenge, only a willingness to move forward, to build a new world. He looked back at Isolde, and in her eyes, he saw not an enemy, not a monster, but a woman. A woman of extraordinary power, a woman of unwavering compassion, a woman who had saved them all. He fell to his knees, his head bowed, his body shaking with sobs. I am so sorry, he whispered. For everything, for all the pain, for all the deaths. Isolde knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. We all have made mistakes, Silas, she said. We all have been blinded by fear, by hatred, by the past. But we can learn from our mistakes. We can change. We can heal. Ryland stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the assembled hunters. We offer you a choice, he said, his voice strong and clear. A chance to join us. A chance to build a new world, a world where werewolves and humans can coexist in peace. A world where our children can grow up without fear, without hatred, without the curse of the past. He paused, his eyes locking with Silas's. Will you join us? He asked. Silas looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He looked at his former comrades, the hunters who had followed him for so long, the hunters who were now looking to him for guidance, for a decision. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of conflict, of hatred, of pain. And then he exhaled, a long, slow exhale that seemed to release all the darkness, all the fear, all the burden of the past. Yes, he said, his voice firm and clear, resonating with a newfound conviction. Yes, we will. A collective cheer erupted from the werewolves and former hunters, a cry of joy, of relief, of triumph. The hunters, their faces now lit with hope, with understanding, with a sense of belonging, stepped forward, joining the circle, becoming part of the new world. Isolde and Ryland stood together, their hands clasped tightly, their hearts filled with love, with hope, with the promise of a future they had never dared to dream of. The final confrontation had not been a battle of weapons, of force, of power. It had been a confrontation of hearts, a battle won with empathy, with understanding, with love. The curse of the blood moon binding, the ancient conflict between hunters and werewolves, had been broken. Not by violence, not by magic, but by the simple, profound power of human connection. The war was over. The healing had begun. And a new world, a world of peace, of understanding, of love, was dawning. The rising sun bathed them all in its golden light. A promise. A new beginning. The air was clear, and for the first time in a long time, they could breathe. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, slowly faded, replaced by the gentle patina of time and healing. Blackwood Manor became a symbol of unity, a place where werewolves and humans lived and worked together, their lives intertwined, their differences celebrated, their common humanity affirmed. The council, established by Ryland and Isolde, flourished, becoming a model for interspecies cooperation, a testament to the power of empathy and understanding. Lyra, Ryland's sister, became a respected leader, her wisdom and strength guiding the community through challenges and triumphs. Silas, once their fiercest enemy, became one of their strongest allies, his experience and insights invaluable in navigating the complexities of their new world. Children were born, both werewolf and human, growing up together, unaware of the ancient conflict that had once divided their ancestors, learning only of the peace that had been forged by their parents, by their community. Isolde and Ryland, their love deepened by time, by shared experiences, by the unwavering bond that connected them, remained at the heart of Blackwood Manor, their presence a constant source of inspiration, of guidance, of love. The moon's kiss sigil on Isolde's wrist, once a symbol of a binding curse, became a symbol of hope, a reminder of the power of empathy, of the transformative potential of love, of the enduring strength of the human spirit. They often walked in the clearing, the place where their journey had truly begun, the place where they had faced their greatest challenges, the place where they had found each other. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the woods, they stood hand in hand, watching their grandchildren play, their laughter echoing through the trees, a symphony of joy, of innocence, of a future secured. Isolde leaned her head against Ryland's shoulder, her silver hair shimmering in the fading light, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with contentment. "We built a new world." Ryland smiled, his golden eyes reflecting the warmth of the setting sun, his hand tightening around hers. "Yes," he said. "We did. Together." He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, a love that had conquered, a love that had healed, a love that would last forever. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their light a silent witness to the enduring peace, the enduring love, the enduring hope that had blossomed in the heart of Blackwood Manor, a beacon for a world yearning for understanding, for connection, for a future free from the shadows of the past. The air